Hello again, everybody. So my name is Gerhard Tufs. I'm assistant professor at the New Economic School, and I'm very happy to be able to host today's lecture. I'm also very glad to see that we're joined today by so many people. We would also like to know where you're actually joining us from. So please let us know in which city you're currently located. The link for the poll should appear now in the chats. And towards the end of the introduction, we will take a brief look at the map. Our lecture will be in English on Zoom. You can switch to a simultaneous Russian translation by clicking on the globe icon at the bottom of the Zoom window and switch to Russian. This option is also available in the toolbar of the Zoom mobile app. Moreover, we also broadcast the lecture in Russian on the YouTube channels of NES and Kommersant Publishing House. Now, today's lecture is the third in a series of 5 guest lectures given by the world's leading researchers on their respective topics. All lectures are online in English and freely accessible after registration. Now, our series opened with the lecture by Northwestern University professor Joël Moncur, who spoke about the main drivers of economic growth in Europe throughout the 18th and 19th century. The second lecture was given by Esther Duflo, who is one of the last year's recipients of the Nobel Prize in Economics. The lecture was dedicated to a variety of pressing economic issues such as inequality, migration, and climate change, and which tools economic researchers suggest to tackle and solve, or at least alleviate some of the issues. After today's lecture, on the 6th of October, Stefani Stancheva, economic professor at Harvard University, will talk about people's perceptions of economic problems and how such perceptions relate to reality. Now, during the final lecture on the 14th of October, Adam Alter, professor of at the Stern Business School, will be talking about people's addiction to modern technology. Good for us. He will also suggest some solutions to overcome such addictions. Now, to learn more about the New Economic School public lectures, go to the website lectorium.nes.ru. Throughout this academic year, we'll be organizing many other events online. Hence, if you're interested, please follow our social media accounts and register for our newsletters containing information for prospective students. All links are available in the chats. Today, we will also award a 2-month subscription to Bookmate ebook services to the guest who will ask today's speakers the most interesting question. Submit your question in the chats on Zoom and YouTube, and some of the questions will be raised during the Q&A session in roughly an hour. The organization of the New Economic School public lectures is supported by the Charitable Foundation SAFMAR. Our media partner is the publishing house Kommersant. Our partners also include Voodoo Project and econs.online. Now, let me, and this is a great honor, present today's speaker, Sir Paul Collier, who is professor in economics and public policy at the Blavatnik School of Government at the University of Oxford. He is also director of the International Growth Center. In the past, he was director of the Development Research Group at the World Bank between 1998 and 2003. In 2010 and 2011, he was named by the Foreign Policy magazine in the list of the top global thinkers. In 2014, Paul Collier received the knighthood for promoting research on and policy change in Africa. His research covers many areas, including the causes and consequences of civil war, the effects of aid, and the problems of democracy in low-income and natural resource-rich economies, urbanization in low-income countries, and private investment in African infrastructure. His latest book, The Future of Capitalism, Facing the New Anxieties, was included in Bill Gates' 5 books for summer reading 2019. Good for us. The ideas developed in these books will be the topic of his talk today, The Future of Capitalism. Now, before I give the floor to Professor Collier, let's briefly take a look at the map to see the cities and countries which we are joined from today. So, I hope we all see the map. Ooh, very nice. So, not surprisingly, there is a bit bias towards former Soviet Union countries, Central Asia, Russia, but many, many places within Europe. And North America, I see to the left. Yeah, Greece, UK, London. Oh, I guess in the very north of Russia, which could be Norilsk, and Murmansk, and Vladivostok. Are we joined from Africa and Latin America as well? Could you? Nobody signed up for those regions yet. Okay, so North America, Europe, and Asia it is. So, and at that point, I would, without further ado, ask Paul to start his lecture. I'm looking forward to it.
Thanks very much indeed. So I'm going to be talking about this book here, The Future of Capitalism. But let me start with something about the past of capitalism. And I'm going to start the story in 1945. And not just capitalism, but communism, because one thing that both Russia and Britain, America had in common in 1945 was that we'd fought and we'd won a war, a huge war in which all our populations made massive sacrifices. And that process of huge sacrifice for a common goal of defeating fascism, that brought people together in a sense of shared identity around a common purpose. And that, in a way unrealized at the time, was a huge asset for a society. So both in Russia and in Britain and in North America, that ability to forge a forward-looking common purpose and work towards it was a massive push forward. And so for all three societies, the next couple of decades were really times of progress. Now, there was a lot more progress in Britain and America than in Russia from 1945 to 65. And that was because we had different economic systems. And the big difference between communism and what was called capitalism was that capitalism produced a much more decentralized level of decisions. Firms were teams of people with capacities trying to solve problems in a market economy. They were given a lot of freedom of decision as long as they were able to survive competitively. Whereas in Russia under the Soviet Union, decision-taking was very, very highly centralized. And one of the things we've learned is that for various reasons, decentralized systems are able to discover solutions to problems much more quickly than highly centralized systems. And so, because of those advantages of capitalism, America, Europe, Britain all moved ahead more rapidly. So that was the story 1945, really through until about 1980. And then from 1980, capitalism, especially in Britain and America, starts to go wrong. It starts to derail. And it derails, it's a slow derailment that builds up over the next 40 years, producing greater and greater social tensions. So first, let me go through the social tensions and what happened. So one new social tension was spatial, and it was between the biggest cities, the metropolis in each country, exemplified by the role of London in Britain, and the rest of the country. So you've got a spatial divide opening up between, in Britain, between London and provincial Britain. That, until 1980, for 200 years, spatial differences had been narrowing. So the difference between the poorer regions within Britain and the richer regions, as elsewhere in advanced economies, had been narrowing for 200 years. And then from 1980 onwards, it goes into reverse. And it goes into reverse really quite alarmingly rapidly, so that by now in Britain, the average person in London is 70% more productive than the average person in provincial Britain. So that was a huge opening up of divergence. That was the spatial divide. Then there was another divide, which is in effect, it's the new class divide. And the new class divide is based on education. And again, it reverses a previous 200 years in which the less educated gradually caught up with the incomes of the more educated. So for 200 years, until 1980, these differences between the less educated and the more educated were getting narrower in terms of income. And then again, from 1980 onwards, it starts to widen again. And again, it becomes quite vicious, especially in Britain and America. So on the basis of a decent university education, people are able to move on to specialist skills, cognitive skills, such as lawyers, bankers, and these become ever more highly valued in the society. And so the well-educated find themselves on a rising escalator of prosperity. Meanwhile, the less well-educated, they had invested not in cognitive skills, but in manual skills, the skills of the hand. And they gradually found that those manual skills were becoming less and less valuable. And so the class divide is a skilled, well-educated group on an up escalator, and a less educated manual skill group on a down escalator. Now, these two social divergences, the spatial and the educational, intertwine. And so if you're a bright kid from the provinces, from a provincial city, the best thing for you to do becomes to leave it and move to the metropole, where there are all these fancy jobs and rising incomes. I exemplify that. I grew up in Sheffield, which was Britain's big industrial steel city. It had been a steel city for about 700 years. But the steel industry in Britain collapsed in the early 1980s. And Sheffield imploded as an economy. If you look at a healthy city in cross-section, the closer you get to the city centre, the higher is productivity. It looks like a pyramid. So the people on the edge and the periphery of the city are less productive than the people in the centre of the city. And that was true of Sheffield when I grew up. But it ceased to be true during the 1980s. The city imploded, and so now it looks like an inverted V. It looks like a V. And why is that? Because many people are still living in the heart of the city, but the industries that produce high productivity have all collapsed, the steel industry. And so to become productive, if you live in Sheffield, you've got to get away from it. So I was a kid, grew up in Sheffield. Both my parents left school at 12. I managed to get a good state education. I got to Oxford, I became a professor. I've had chairs at Oxford, Harvard, Paris. So I'm part of the metropolitan elite. And many kids like me joined me. We left. Now that, of course, aggravates the problem of the places left behind. They lose, if you like, their brightest and their best and their youngest and their most energetic. And that deepens the sense of demoralization and despair. So that's what happens to the places left behind. What happens to the very successful people in the metropole, the ones that are on the rising escalator? Remember, we started this story in 1945, where we'd all just fought a war together, and there was an enormous sense of shared identity and common purpose. That eroded, and it eroded not from the bottom of society, it eroded from the top. So the most successful people living in the capital started to shift their identity away from where part of this country we share identity with people who are living in these left behind cities. We're fortunate, and so we have obligations to them. That's what would have happened in 1945. By the 1980s, a different narrative came in, a narrative that we are successful. Why are we successful? Because of our own individual efforts. We are the meritocracy, and we deserve our high earnings because we're so productive. We're productive because we're clever and we've worked hard for it. We've succeeded in education. We are the meritocracy. So that was one of the really bad ideas that infected society, starting from about the 1980s, the rise of individualism and a new identity as a peer member of a group of high achievers, rather than as a peer member of a group of fellow citizens, of which you were at the fortunate end. And so it was peeling away from mutuality and shared identity. That process of peeling off at the top got compounded by some other very bad ideas. Pretty well the worst idea came from Milton Friedman in Chicago. And he produced a new theory of the firm, which said the sole purpose of the firm is to make profits for shareholders. So this was a theory of the firm as the vehicle for the interest of shareholders. And together with a load of other ideas in economics, what came up was the idea that what you needed was a sort of Superman chief executive who was very smart, and this smart chief executive knew, in the phrase of Chicago, knew the model. He understood how the world worked. He understood how his firm could succeed. And his problem was how to get his workforce to do what he wanted. And his workforce posed a real problem because the economic theory of human beings that developed in the 1950s and became really operational in the 1970s and 80s was the theory of economic man. And who was economic man? He was greedy, he was selfish, and he was lazy. His utility function was described in which labor entered negatively, and that was lazy. So greedy, selfish, lazy. And economists thought that that's what Darwin and evolution was telling them, that the survival of the fittest meant the greediest and the most selfish and the people who only worked in their own interest. So here was this super clever chief executive at the top of the firm. The trouble is, he was also greedy, lazy, and selfish. So what should shareholders do? Well, they should incentivize him to strain every muscle to make profits for the firm. And the only way they could do that was if they really escalated his income in return for profits. And so this was the introduction of the highly incentivized bonus culture. And so in America, pay differentials between chief executives and their workforce widened from something like 30 to 1 in the 1960s to something like 300 to 1 now. So a huge opening up of what's called very high-powered incentives for very high-powered people. So that was the problem facing shareholders. They solved it by incentivizing the chief executive. But the chief executive still had the problem of how to get his greedy, lazy, selfish workforce to do what he understood was what needed to be done. And so the challenge was to build incentives all the way down the system. And that's what the block of economic theory known as principal agent theory solved. And essentially what it said was the chief executive needs to set up a system in which everybody else is monitored, scrutinized closely, and their monitored performance linked to incentives and penalties. So we have the structure of a top-down society. The chief executive knows best, and all the way down the incentivize and monitor these greedy, lazy, selfish people to do what the chief executive wants. So that was the theory of capitalism that emerged in the 1970s and 80s. And by the 1990s, it started to be copied in the public sector. In fact, Britain led the way. I was at a dinner with the then head of the British Civil Service, where he proudly explained that he himself was on an incentive pay system, where he agreed performance criteria with the Prime Minister each year and then got a bonus according to how much he delivered. And he was explaining how he'd pushed this system all the way down through the public sector. So that was the capitalism that was emerging from about 1980 onwards. What it results in, partly these big economic divergences, the educated, the less educated, the metropole, the provinces, which just get neglected. Those divergences are not addressed because the political power is with the well-educated in the metropolis. And they have peeled off from shared identity with the provincials. So they neither know nor care what's happening. And so those divergences build up for about 40 years, and then they result in mutinies. In Britain, the mutiny was Brexit. Every province of England and Wales, except London, voted for Brexit. It wasn't really a mutiny against Brussels, which only handled about 1% of Britain's GDP. It was a mutiny against London. This was their chance to protest against the London elite. So that was, and of course the equivalent mutiny in America was Trump. So these were, again, the provincial less educated, just using the opportunity to protest against what had happened. Within each firm, you got this, and within the public sector, you've got an equally unpleasant process in which the power of discretion and judgment was stripped off ordinary people. They became cogs in a machine, told what to do by this smart head of the civil service or smart chief executive, monitored and incentivized, so that they lost the power of discretion. Survey evidence shows that over in Britain, we've asked the same question over the last 25 years, which is basically, do you have enough power of discretion in your job to do it properly to your own satisfaction? 25 years ago, most people said yes. There's been a 40% drop in yes. Now most people say no, because they recognize that they're just cogs in a machine. Not only was that repellent, and it didn't work very well. It didn't even work very well in the firms which had inspired the idea. So what Friedman and what Economic Man was all about, the firm which inspired it all was General Motors, which was the biggest and most profitable firm the world had ever seen. The company, the main manufacturer of cars in America. And in the 60s, it was hugely successful. It had this system of monitoring top-down control. And then along came a upstart little rival from Japan called Toyota. And Toyota didn't have a lower cost base than General Motors, and it was an unknown Japanese company at the time. Japan was not associated with high quality at all. And so how could Toyota penetrate the American auto market? And this is an extraordinary story where General Motors had this top-down, the top-nose best. We just try and force the workforce into compliance. And Toyota had an entirely different philosophy, a philosophy much more like that Second World War philosophy that Russia, Britain, and America had, that management viewed itself as aligned with its workforce. And so management dressed like the workers, ate in the same canteen as the workers, and didn't go for these spectacularly high pay levels. And so management could use the word we without being left out. Obviously, if the chief executive of General Motors said to his workforce we, whilst getting out of his corporate jet on 300 times their pay, the workforce didn't hear we, they heard you. And so what Toyota was able to do was a totally new way of managing quality control. And that was the invention of what's called quality circles. They weren't literally circles, because they applied to the production line, the assembly line of Toyota cars. And you can picture the assembly line of Toyota cars, just like the assembly line of General Motors cars, as incredibly long, continuous process in which different tasks were added all the way along the assembly line. And in General Motors, the quality control problem was handled once the cars came off the conveyor belt. You'd test 1 in 50 and see whether it's working all right. Toyota adopted a different policy. They said the responsibility for quality lies with the workers themselves on that production line. And they introduced a motto that said, faults are treasures. If you on the production line spot a fault, alert us at once, because then we can fix it. Well, how was the workers to alert the management? Well, the management hung cords all the way down the assembly line and said, if you see a fault, pull that cord. It will stop the entire assembly line. The cost of stopping an entire car assembly line, $10,000 a minute. So if a Japanese worker at Toyota was aggrieved with Toyota and pulled it needlessly, it would be a colossal economic disaster. They could inflict massive damage very, very quickly. But Japanese workers took on this idea that only by producing good quality cars will we be able to compete with General Motors. And it's our responsibility. And so that's what the staff did in Toyota. They spotted the faults, but didn't pull the cords otherwise. And that produced much higher quality cars than General Motors. In fact, when I moved with my wife to America in 1998, we bought a little Toyota car because it had such a good reputation, and 22 years later, it's still running. So General Motors, this huge, very profitable company, started to lose market share to Toyota. And they didn't understand what was going on. First, they thought it was robots. So they sent a team to Toyota who were very cooperative. They photographed everything that Toyota had got, and they said, if they've got robots, we get robots. That established it wasn't robots. Finally, about 100 McKinsey consultant reports later, the truth was given to the chief executive. And so the chief executive said, right, they got these cords hanging down the assembly line, we'll put them in. And so they put the cords all along the assembly line at General Motors. But General Motors, for 50 years, had been building antagonism in its workforce. The workforce was the greedy, lazy, selfish enemy, which had to be monitored, scrutinized, controlled. And so the line managers in General Motors knew all too well what would happen if Fred and Joe were given an opportunity to inflict damage of $10,000 a minute on General Motors. That line would never be running. And so the line managers, who were themselves on bonuses for this line running, the line managers tied the cords back up again as an emblem of we don't trust you. That could hardly be bettered. By 2009, the story ended. It ended because General Motors went bankrupt. Toyota had broken General Motors. So here was a system which didn't work socially and didn't even work in the firms where it was most vigorously applied. And it turns out the reason it didn't work was that basic premise of economic man and of Friedman, the purpose of the firm is to make profits. Those premises are just wrong. And the reason they were wrong is that economists had very badly misunderstood what humans were about, how humans had evolved. We are not just greedy, lazy, and selfish. We are all three of those. We can recognize it in our own natures if we're honest, but we're much more than that. And modern evolutionary biology has established that we're very, very different from greedy, lazy, selfish. So what I'm going to describe now is the evidence from the evolutionary biologist Joe Heinrich at Harvard, very good book called The Secret of Our Success, and his equivalent at Yale, Nicholas Christakis, and also a wonderful book called Blueprint. And what they find is that we're a very distinctive sort of mammal. Humans are the only mammal that is really very pro-social. In fact, we're designed to solve two problems. One is we're designed to build common purpose in a group. That's how we've evolved. We've evolved not to be greedy, lazy, selfish individuals, but to build and deliver common purpose in a group. And the way we do that is that we're hardwired to want to belong to a group. Not only do we want to belong to a group, whether it's a community of like a place or a community of work, we want to belong to it, and this is really important, we want to win the respect of the other members of that group. And to win their respect, we have to follow the norms of the group. So if the group manages to build norms of common purpose, like Russia, Britain, and America did coming out of the war, then the pressure from wanting to win the good opinion of the group actually polices the norms. So you get a lot of willing compliance with that common purpose. Game theory has shown that you need a little bit of force as well to discipline the tiny minority that are not willingly compliant with common purpose. But that's a sort of residual operation rather than the only way that you get compliance. So we're hardwired to build common purpose and mutuality, much more so than any other mammal. The other thing we're hardwired to do is we're designed for an unknowable future, because for most of human evolution, we were confronted with things we didn't understand, just as we're currently being confronted by COVID. If in January you ask the question, what should we do in response to COVID, the honest answer was, nobody knows. Yeah? And repeatedly in human history, that's the situation we're faced with. In economics, the concept is known as radical uncertainty, that we don't know the future. Friedman was one of the architects of sweeping radical uncertainty under the carpet. In an illegitimate analytic move, he reduced everything to known probabilities. Quite obviously, with COVID, we don't know the probabilities of particular actions. They are unknowable. And so, for good reason, as humans, we've evolved to cope and manage with these unknowable futures, with radical uncertainty. There's a very good book by my colleague John Kay and Mervyn King, the former governor of the Bank of England, came out this year called Radical Uncertainty. I've just actually written a book with John called Greed is Dead. Here it is. It's not. Future of Capitalism is being translated into Russian. But Greed is Dead is not yet. It's only just out, even in Britain last month. So we've evolved to cope with unknowable futures. And how have we done that? It's not by this idea, we know what to do. It's by recognizing we don't know what to do. And if you recognize what you don't know what to do, the right answer is try and find out. So how do we try and find out? Well, we learn from others. It turns out we're very good at learning from others. That indeed, in Heinrich's phrase, is the secret of our success. We're good at imitating success. But the other thing is we experiment, we try things, trial and error. And if you're going to do experiment, the more experiments, the better. And that's why a decentralized system works so much better than a highly centralized system. A highly centralized system, the politicians are very over-inclined to say, I know what to do, and we're going to do it everywhere. Very few politicians have the courage to say, I don't know what to do, and so I'm not going to tell you what to do. I'm going to let you, down at your local areas, work it out for yourselves. And some of you will get it right, some of you will get it wrong. But we'll learn from the successes, and people will imitate those successes. That is the proper way to deal with an unknowable future. So that was the real secret of why capitalism worked. It was decentralized. Economists thought that it worked because people were very greedy, and so the engine oil, the fuel that drove capitalism was greed, and hence this need to have very high-powered incentives. The fuel that drives capitalism is not greed. It's this decentralized ability to come up with new ideas. And again, we're hardwired as human beings because we're a very unusual mammal, not only that we're very pro-social, and capable of mutuality, we're very unusual in being really imaginative, using our imaginations to think of better futures than we've got at the moment, and then using our imaginations, our creative imaginations, to try and work out possible solutions. That's what makes humans dynamic. We're constantly coming up with visions of how our circumstances, our societies could be better, and then trying to come up with ways of making them better, and ways of realizing that attractive vision. So that's humans at our best. We are imaginative and creative, and that makes us very dynamic, unlike other mammals. Let me give you the comparison with a very clever mammal, a squirrel. A squirrel is able to be forward-looking. They store nuts for the winter. It's very good. It's better than my children do. They're not very forward-looking at the moment. They're only teenagers. So squirrels plan ahead. And squirrels are brilliant at running up trees and jumping around, right? But if you wanted to understand what a squirrel was like 100,000 years ago, just look at a squirrel now. They haven't changed in 100,000 years. And now think of humans. If you wanted to think of a human, what a human was like 100,000 years ago, genetically, he was identical to us. Right? There has been basically no change in the genetic code for 100,000 years. But the life of a human being 100,000 years ago was totally, utterly different from the life of a human being now. Why? Because we've kept imagining improvements and kept discovering ways of delivering them. So that's the real nature of humanity. And we need to hardwire our societies, not for greedy, lazy, selfish individuals with firms that are run to maximize the profits of the firm. We need to recognize that they're hardwired to form purposive communities, communities with some forward-looking common purpose. And those communities are sometimes communities of place. We're hardwired to belong to places, and we're hardwired to have these common purposes, and so communities of work. So communities of place and communities of work. What we need is a capitalism that actually promotes communities of place and communities of work that are driven by forward-looking common purpose. And instead, we've had a capitalism over the last 40 years that has basically been destroying them. Destroying communities of place, driving the brightest and the best just to detach from place and go and live in the metropolis, and destroying communities of work because people have been stripped of autonomy. And that is the tragedy of the derailment of capitalism in the last 40 years. Let me give you one little bit of evidence, and then I'll turn to what can be done very briefly, and then we'll stop. So the evidence comes from regrets. And this is work that social psychologists have done. You can do it yourself. But I warn you, if you're my age, don't do it. It's really painful. Right? One of the most painful things I've done in recent years. Right? So you get it? Here's what you've got to do. On your own, in a quiet moment, get a sheet of paper and write down the 3 things in your life you most regret. By my age, that really hurts if you do it honestly. The social psychologists analyzed said, and then classify them. What are the big regrets? If we were all greedy, lazy, selfish economic man, what would be our big regrets? Oh, if only I'd bought Apple shares. If only I'd bought that house or got that job. We've all got regrets like that. Well, I don't, but they don't make it to the top three at all. The top three regrets, all of the form: I let my mother down, I let my family down, I let my colleagues down. They're regrets about a betrayal of common purpose. And that's an example of the evidence that we are actually hardwired for much better than greedy, lazy, selfish. Last 2 or 3 minutes, what can we do about it? Well, a lot of the book, The Future of Capitalism and of Greed is Dead, is about practically what we can do. But I think I'll leave that for questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. So we had roughly 500 guests. And we have by now, wait a second, I give you the exact number, 257 questions.
Okay, we'll be here for a week.
So there is no way I will be able to ask all of those questions. But what I've tried to do in the last 30 minutes, I tried to put them into bins.
Yeah.
And I will go through them. They're still coming in, so I might add 1 or 2. But let me try and go through the main questions as I understood them. Let me kick this off with maybe something obvious, given the history of the country. So your book makes the argument that capitalism should be managed and not defeated. And you basically do not talk about the other isms. This is kind of directly implying that you're kind of disregarding a bit the other systems, such as communism. So you don't think about it too much. You don't think of it as being equally promising as capitalism. Now, obviously, given the history of this country, it's on many people's minds. So could you please, in your words, reiterate? You did that briefly in the beginning, but just maybe a bit more on why you think we couldn't apply the same idea you do now. Like, let's keep capitalism because it has some good features, but change it a bit and do something similar for communism. Yeah, it has some bad features, but maybe it has also some good features. How can we change it and fix it and make it work? So that would be the first question.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's a very, very, very good set of questions. Look, I don't even like the word capitalism much. I think clearly what we need is a system that enables decentralized responsibility. We need widespread moral load-bearing across our societies. Families have to be morally load-bearing. The strong have to look after the weak. Firms have to be morally load-bearing. They have to have a purpose much bigger than just making profits. Communities of place need to have a purpose. There are many different, the biggest epidemic in Britain and America is loneliness. It's a worse killer than anything else. And loneliness is something that can be cured by an active community in a place. It's not very hard to cure loneliness, and it would make a huge psychological difference to many millions of people. So we need widely distributed moral load-bearing. And so let me get back to the question, capitalism, communism. I think, and I go back to the beginning of the lecture, from 1945 for 20 years or so, both the West and Russia were basically had this sense of common purpose, a sense of mutuality, shared identity around a common purpose. Forward-looking. You know, you think of the Soviet Union's technological achievements, the Sputnik, the first man in space, all this, Yuri Gagarin, I remember, you know, this was my youth, I'm afraid, and wow, you know, the future. And so that was very uplifting for people living in Russia at the time. And you know, Britain had its own little successes as well. I remember, you know, the first man to climb Everest was British. Yes, you know, some amazing inventions coming out of Britain. So there were lots of things to feel, oh, yes, this is the common purpose around the future. And all that started to disintegrate, right? Now, I do think that communism at its best was, of course, all about building solidarity and common purpose, which is an essential feature. No society can work, in my view, without that sense of shared identity, building mutuality and common purpose, and responsibility for each other. So communism at its best was that solidarity. Okay? And that needs to be kept. And sadly, Russia, the Soviet Union, lurched from an increasingly dysfunctional aspects of communism, this highly over-centralized decision structure, which was breaking down. The more complex a system, the more you need to decentralize. Complexity requires a lot of what is called tacit knowledge. It's the knowledge that comes from knowing the context and the time. And that is only available through experience. And so the more complex the system, and our modernity is making things more and more complex, the more you need to push decisions down the system. And so communism's big weakness was that it didn't push decisions down the system. It brought them all to the top. And lo and behold, capitalism imitated the worst features of communism. Remember? Highly centralized in the chief executive. Top-down firms. That head of the British civil service, top-down British civil service. So sadly, over the last 40 years, the West has been aping the very worst features of communism. High over-centralized control, stripping people of moral responsibility. And I suspect that Russia sort of lurched from a communism which was breaking down because of rising complexity to a capitalism which was awfully like the worst features of greedy, lazy, selfish. And so, of course, both were unsatisfactory. And you need to bring back the best features of communism, which was the mutuality and solidarity, but link that to the best features of capitalism, which is decentralized decision-taking, not the top knows best, but nobody knows what to do, and so we better have decentralized experiment and learning.
So basically what you're saying is, let's take the best features of the different system, combine them, and maybe even call them differently.
Yes, absolutely. My colleague, John Kay, doesn't want to use the word capitalism anymore.
What is he suggesting?
Such a contaminated concept. You know, why did we call the book Greed is Dead, right?
Okay.
And the new one, because greed, the mantra that produced greed is good, is intellectually false. And so Greed is Dead showing why the ideas that produce the very notion that greed could be good are just wrong. Having cut greed, as it were, off at the knees, ideas gradually filter through. What we need is ambassadors to spread the message, right? And that's why I was so delighted to be invited to give this lecture. I need ambassadors, right? Fortunately, the Future of Capitalism is being translated into Russian. I'm very pleased, right?
That was also one of the questions, why it is not yet. All right, let's move to the second question. So, and this is basically, maybe you can help our audience to structure thoughts. You're discussing different forms of divides triggering anxieties in the books. This is geography, education, and global. But maybe in particular focusing on the first two, so geography and educational. Could you give us like two case studies, two extremes? One country which you think is already moving in the right direction, presumably, I mean, I guess you have some examples in mind, and one country which is like going in the worst possible direction, moving away from what you're suggesting.
Yeah, so I think the country that's sort of most unfortunate at the moment is probably America. And let me use COVID as an example. Right? So COVID, coronavirus, is a case where quite obviously mutuality, willing compliance is vital. You know, the young have the power to kill the old with COVID. Please don't. But equally, behaving well, we can actually control the thing. The most successful country in the OECD for controlling the spread whilst having minimal economic damage is Denmark. Denmark's had very little economic cost compared with anybody else, and it's got very low mortality rate compared with anybody else. Why? Because Denmark is a society which has really built mutuality, common purpose. The leader, Mette Frederiksen, is a young woman, not that much education. She's a single mother, and so she brought up children struggling. She can use the word we, and ordinary Danes around Denmark can hear her and say, yes, we. And so when she says, look, we've got a new problem, COVID's dangerous, people willingly comply with the message, behave carefully towards your neighbors. Don't give your neighbors a disease that might kill them. And that's why people have been able in Denmark very largely to get on with their lives, but in little, they didn't even have to close the schools, but in little ways, people have taken care not to kill their neighbors. So they've really cared for their neighbors. If we go across to America, if you think back to the onset of coronavirus in America, apart from the theatrical denials that it was a problem, and then the advice to drink bleach, which I tried on my family, and it doesn't work actually, just to pass on the information, right? But what did we see as the response to COVID in America? Long queues outside gun shops. Long queues outside gun shops. So it wasn't exactly care for your neighbor, it was more like shoot your neighbor. And shoot your neighbor doesn't even work. It doesn't produce safety. America has a very, very high incidence of excess deaths. So these are two different responses. Denmark, where people were already well trained to mutuality, just saying, oh yes, this is a new common purpose we need to rise to, and we'll do it. And there in America, which over the last 40 years, any shred of mutuality has been hammered out of the society. And so the rise of individualism and the selfish, greedy firm and the selfish, greedy people, the top knows best, both in business and politics, the top knows best. Right? And what it results in is queues outside gun shops and the highest incidence of mortality. You know? So these are the best and the worst.
Thanks. So after we have now those two examples, let me move to the third set of questions. So the common purpose and reciprocal obligations are at the core of the mechanisms which you're suggesting as a solution for functional families, ethical firms, cooperative societies. Now, we all know introducing such norms, changing societies, families, firms is difficult and very time-consuming. Could you provide us with an example or with the idea how you envision such a transition, how long this will take, or kind of guide us maybe in form of a case study in a firm, step by step through how such a transition should take place?
Yeah. So first of all, you're quite right. It's difficult. Right? I'll give you an image. Right? The image of a dinghy, a sailing boat. Right? A sailing boat has two equilibria, both of which are locally stable. Right? One locally stable equilibrium for a sailing boat is the right way up. Right? And the other locally stable equilibrium is if the dinghy is upside down. And believe me, if you've ever sailed a dinghy, an upside down dinghy is a very locally stable equilibrium. Yeah? Now, I'm dealing with my day job is working in very, very poor societies, which are fragmented and in conflict, violent conflict within the society. That's what I sort of spend a lot of time working on and with. They're upside down dinghies. And putting them to rights is very hard. It can only be done within the society. It's not something that can be done to a society by foreigners. It has to be done within. It has to be done by really good leadership. Yeah? Leadership, and here's another unique feature of mammals. We've got two different types of leadership amongst humans, right? All other mammals have only got one type of leadership. It's called dominance. Right? The dominant lion, the dominant tiger, the dominant, right? And of course, humans being mammals also have that. So if you think hard enough, you have to scratch your head, but occasionally you can think of a dominant political leader, right? Who says, I am the commander-in-chief. I know best. Do what I tell you, right? That's dominance, right? And if you don't do what I tell you, you wait, right? So that's dominance. We've got that, obviously. But humans, uniquely amongst mammals, have devised a very different style of leadership, which is equally evolutionary and stable. And that is leadership by a leader who wins the respect of the group, the good opinion of others in the group, by sacrificing their own interest for the interest of the group. Okay? And so that type of leadership is what's needed to turn an upside down dinghy the right way up. And now let me give you an example of a society which did it. Okay? And that's Singapore. If we go back to 1961, it's now very hard to believe because we've got an image of modern Singapore in our heads. 1961, Singapore was a terrible mess. It had three different racial groups: Malays, Indians, Chinese, all of whom hated each other, as racial groups tend to do. On top of that, it had a vicious divide between communists and Democrats because of the very strong influence of communist China. And so it was polarized ideologically and racially. It was a place at war with itself. In fact, Singapore only became independent because it was thrown out of the federation with the Malay Federation. The others didn't want it. Get out. So this was not an auspicious start. And then you got one amazing leader come forward, Lee Kuan Yew. And Lee Kuan Yew was a guy who, he didn't have much money, but he won an election campaign on the campaign, we're going to end corruption. I should have said it was a very corrupt society, very corrupt. Right? So his campaign was, I'm going to end corruption. Well, lots of leaders campaign they're going to end corruption. Right? What they mean is, I'm going to jail my opponents by accusing them of corruption. Right? So Lee Kuan Yew won the election, came to power. He won the election because he had a rich supporter who financed his campaign. And then after the election, he gave that rich supporter a position of influencing government. And he discovered that that rich supporter was corrupt, was using his position corruptly. So what does Lee Kuan Yew do with that guy? He's financed his election campaign. It's very, very important to him. What might he do? He might say, don't let anybody see. He might say, stop doing it. Huh? He doesn't do either of those things. He jails it. He jails it. Does it make you want to be a rich financial supporter of Lee Kuan Yew? Not particularly, right? Was this a costly bit of behavior for Lee Kuan Yew? Hugely costly. Right? Did it establish beyond a shadow of doubt with the Singapore population that he meant what he said? Yes. And then Lee Kuan Yew started to say, I don't want to hear about all this. You're Indian, you're Chinese, you're Malay, you're Singaporean now. And he actually micromanaged that process of where people could live in social housing. Social housing was apartments, corridors. He made sure right at the individual level that you didn't have Malay, 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 Chinese, Chinese, Chinese. You had Malay, Chinese, Indian, Malay, Chinese, Indian, all mixed up so that people got to know each other. And gradually they discovered, yeah, we're all Singaporeans. And then he delivered common purpose, a forward-looking common purpose. He said, here we are, we're in a great position. Our future is to become a global entrepreneur. So we've got to welcome the outside. We've got to trade with everybody. And that worked. As that worked, people said, yeah, that seems to work. That seems to be right. And so he built people saying, yes, okay. Now Singapore is vastly richer than Britain. Used to be much poorer when I was a kid. Huh? So overtaken Britain years ago. It's an amazing society. And what he really built, Lee Kuan Yew, was this compliance with common purpose. Huh? So that's both the sort of the theory and the of good leadership, self-sacrificing leadership, and an example.
Thanks. A very brief, maybe follow-up question, because it now became intriguing because it became so explicit. And you also discussed this more in a book. So towards the end of the first chapter, you're providing examples of leaders who have been actually successful by being pragmatic.
Yeah.
And choosing pragmatism over ideologies.
Absolutely.
And this and the example you just gave already suggests that, well, the leader matters. So whatever the system which we're operating with, democratic or non, we want to make sure that we get the right leader into the position. So what is most recent economic research, or what you're aware of, is telling us about the appropriate choice of leaders who can actually move?
So this is a further reason why devolved government is so valuable. Because devolved government is not only experiments in policies which work and policies which don't, they're experiments in leadership. So some people, the head of a local government, turn out to be good leaders, and some turn out to be bad. Right? And so a decentralized system is more likely to produce leaders who've learned the skill and proved themselves at local level, and then gradually move up the system. You see, so for example, I'm quite impressed with Germany here, not with Chancellor Merkel, but with the Deputy Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, who was the Minister of Finance. Before that, he was Mayor of Hamburg. And in fact, the whole Hamburg, I used to know them when they were running Hamburg, because they were interested in my work. And now they're running the country because they demonstrated in Hamburg. They learned how to do it in Hamburg. They learned how to build a successful city. So that's just an example of people moving up from local level. And so it's another reason why devolved government is actually quite a useful approach. Britain's the opposite of that, right? Until very recently, we've had no local positions of any influence at all. The only one we've done is Mayor of London, and so it's not surprising that who's Prime Minister at the moment? A guy who was the Mayor of London, because you couldn't be Mayor of anything else.
Before I move on to another set of questions, one question which just came in, and I think it kind of fits to our current reality. So Elena, this is one of the questions she just asked, was about, so one of your divides is education. And she's basically asking whether the digitization of education and the fact that, I don't know, we now all have access to information from Harvard, from Oxford, Cambridge, is actually going to reduce this divide potentially?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there are really two different types of skills that matter in education: cognitive skills and vocational skills. And Britain in particular is very, very good at building cognitive skills. So is America. You know, Britain got 3 of the top 10 universities in the world. America's got 5 or something like that. You know, so we're very good at cognitive skills in Britain and America, but that only applies to the people who, you know, got a lot of cognitive stuff to build on. What about the other half of society? They're not stupid, but they've got other skills. They've got, we know that from work on what makes a good worker, that, for example, social skills are very, very important. The ability to work in a team, for example, right? Or creativity, which is quite different from cognitive skills, or things like patience, attention to detail. These are not cognitive skills at all, right? And Britain and America are terrible at building those non-cognitive skills, which are as important as the cognitive skills. The most successful society that I know of for the non-cognitive skills is Switzerland, which has brilliant vocational training, very high status. You could end up running a Swiss bank through the vocational route. You don't need to go to the University of Zurich, even though that's a top 10 university in the world. So yes, it's good that we've digitalized so that the best cognitive training is available to all. That's good, but it only levels the playing field amongst the cognitively gifted. That's valuable, but it's at best only half the story, right? It's quite comic. The most watched lecture in the world is Michael Sandel's moral philosophy lectures at Harvard, which are marvelous. And he liked me as a communitarian, I should say. And there was so it's there online, you can watch it for free. And there were a group of philosophers in other universities in America who created a petition complaining about him, saying basically he's taking work from us. People should have the right to listen to bad philosophy lecturers, and so we need to silence the good philosophy lecturers, something like that, right? I managed to persuade Oxford to do its first mass online course, which is called From Poverty to Prosperity. And that's been watched by thousands of people from all over the world. So I'm rather proud of that. Oxford's decided it's such bad competition that the only way you should be able to get an Oxford education is by coming to Oxford. That they've sort of been closed down, which I think is a bit sad. But anyway, I shouldn't complain.
So we have roughly 6 minutes left. I would like to use the last 6 minutes for 3 questions coming predominantly for the younger. I mean, the biggest part of the audience are students and college students, university students, and they have, beyond the topic you've discussed today, a very specific set of questions. So the first one would be, if I want to prepare, but if they want to prepare for an education as an economist, so which are the top 3 books you would recommend they should read before going to university?
I would actually start with a non-economics book, to be honest. I'd start with Nicholas Christakis' book Blueprint, which came out last year. I think that's a very useful antidote to Greedy, Lady, Selfish, right? It's a marvelous book, very uplifting. And then I turn to the book by John Kay and Mervyn King called Radical Uncertainty, because that will tell you a lot about where economics went wrong. Right? And only then would I let you loose on any of the many good economics textbooks, but you'll see their limitations as well as their strengths.
Thanks. I think
economics is an overconfident, arrogant subject that I think has gone somewhat astray. And so we need young people, we desperately need young people to come into it and rebuild it, but rebuild better, build back better, to coin a phrase.
The question I'm going to ask is also kind of like summarizing and forwarding. It's far too big and could easily fill another lecture, but let me just try, and maybe you have one advice on that. And I think it's nicely linked to the beginning of your book. So in the book, you talk a bit about the divide, how this divide you're talking about, the geographical, the educational across societies, actually relates to your own life. And presumably this made it easier for you to understand, to identify with this. And as a result of that, this kind of gave you purpose.
Absolutely.
and I think this is great. I think people can be very lucky if they reach that point. So maybe you would have one word of advice on how to successfully search for purpose.
Yeah, so here is the opening picture in The Future of Capitalism. It's a picture of two little kids, born on the same day. They're about 4 years old. One of them is me, one of them is my cousin. So we're born into the same social class. Our parents didn't have much education and so on, but our lives have completely, radically diverged. Her father died when she was 14, and she became a teenage mother. Her two daughters became teenage mothers. That was a tragedy. And I've cycled back because on the front cover is me and a little boy. And the little boy is the next generation of those teenage pregnancies, and I'm bringing him up. And he's a wonderful kid. And all that potential was derailed for 2 generations by just very good luck for me and very bad luck for my cousin. And so that seared into my mind the notion of responsibility for others. We are not, those of us who succeed are not succeeding because I deserve it. We're succeeding because we're really fortunate, and top of our minds should be the responsibilities we have to people who've been less fortunate. So all the people listening to this lecture are in the fortunate category of society. You're educated enough to want to do this. Remember that you have obligations to people who are just as deserving as you, but have had much less chance.
Last question, and this is very specific and related to the set of questions, but it's very specific to actually, well, I guess your position. So for all the students who are interested in applying to the MPhil or DPhil program at the University of Oxford, what is the 1 or 2 things you would like to see in an application of a student?
Oh, very good. Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, at the Blavatnik School, we look for a few things. One is we look for some sense of purpose larger than yourself. Right? That's not a bad idea, you know. If it's all about me, that's not great, is it? And secondly, some little sense of originality. Doesn't have to be. Don't exaggerate there. You know, I groan when, mainly with my doctoral students, I try and persuade them that they shouldn't stick with the very first idea they had. It was probably wrong. So there's a time when you should throw darts at a dartboard, and then there's a time when you just only need one dart. With one dart, that's all you need, right? So a sense of wanting to learn, of wanting to understand, not just a sense of I want to further my career. You know, the dismal process in Britain of people getting a fancy degree in economics and then going and working for an investment bank where their job was to plunder the assets of pensioners, basically. We don't want that. Right? There's better things in life than that.
Then there are 2 more things for me to do. So first, to announce that Anastasia Valyova is the winner of the best question. She is based in Minsk at the State University of Economics, and she will be contacted by our team. And a great thank you to you. It was a great pleasure. I also enjoyed very much reading the book. I can also very much recommend. Thanks for taking the time. Unfortunately, the times are such that you couldn't be here in person. Maybe another time.
Thank you very much. Please be ambassadors.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.